John Fitzgerald Kennedy, better known as JFK, is probably the most well-known politician of the 20th century. I would wager that nearly every single American, at the very least, knows his name, and rather sadly, knows how he died. His assassination would rock the nation and revolutionize the protection of the president. Today, we are not here to talk about JFK's presidency, nor his death. Instead, we are here to talk about JFK's faith, and how that faith influenced his rise to the presidency. This is part 2 in a series based around examining the 4 Catholic candidates for the presidency. In the first episode, we discussed the general state of Catholics in the U.S. up until the early 20th century, along with the failed attempt by Al Smith to gain the highest office in the land. While I don't think it is completely necessary that you watch that video before watching this one, I would recommend it, as it sort of sets the stage for a lot of the issues and attacks that JFK himself would receive. JFK was born in 1917 in a town called Brookline in Massachusetts, which is just outside of Boston. His father was Joseph Patrick Kennedy, and his mother was Rose Kennedy. The Kennedy family was extremely active in politics, and they were devout Catholics. The family was also, as we will later see, extremely rich. The family held prominent positions, such as mayor of Boston, United States congressman, and Massachusetts state legislator, just to name a few. Kennedy had 8 other siblings, all of which would go on to live some sort of public life, save for his eldest brother, who was killed in active duty during World War II. I am skipping a lot here, simply because Kennedy's childhood would take quite some time to fully dive into, but the family moved around the Northeast for much of JFK's life, while still maintaining a strong presence in not just Massachusetts politics, but also the national level politics. Kennedy would eventually enroll in Harvard, where he would graduate with a degree in government. Kennedy would also serve in the United States Naval Reserve during World War II. Afterwards, Kennedy would run for Congress in the 11th Congressional District of Massachusetts. His father was instrumental in both getting Kennedy elected and giving him a seat to run in the first place. Kennedy's father had urged the previous member of Congress, James Curley, to leave his seat to become mayor of Boston, and then spent a ridiculous amount of money to ensure JFK's election. We can already see some of what would later push Kennedy into the presidency in this early election. His slogan was "The new generation offers a leader," pointing towards his youth and the desire for politics to change. We can also see him beginning to develop the incredible public speaking ability that would undoubtedly help him get elected. Nearly every time he was able to leave Congress, Kennedy would make the journey back to Massachusetts to give speeches and talks to every organization that might come in use for a statewide office run. These efforts and speeches would go on to pay off in the election of 1952, where Kennedy would beat incumbent Senator Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. by about 70,000 votes. Over the next 8 years, Kennedy would slowly build up his national profile by chairing and joining several important congressional committees, along with writing books and generally playing politics among the Democratic Party. He would even come in second in the race to be the vice presidential nominee in 1956. This would all build towards Kennedy's announcement on January 2nd, 1960, that he would run for the Democratic nomination for president. JFK did face much stronger competition than Al Smith did. Then Senate Majority Leader Lyndon B. Johnson, Adlai Stevenson II, their traditional punching bag for the party at the time, and Senator Hubert Humphrey. All 3 of these men had far more political clout than JFK did, and he certainly did not enter the race as a frontrunner. But JFK had one major advantage over them all: his family. Kennedy's campaign was essentially a family affair. His father bankrolled the campaign, while Kennedy's siblings went state by state coming for votes and campaigning. Senator Humphrey even complained that he felt like an independent merchant running against a chain store. Kennedy would go on to win 60% of the vote on primary day, which pushed Humphrey out of the race. The problem for Kennedy was that at the time, the primaries were only half the battle. Much of the voting delegates at the convention were held by the establishment and voted based on how the party wanted them to vote. Because of this, Kennedy was still short by a couple of dozen votes. The competition was now a battle between Kennedy and Johnson. I don't think we can fully say that this was the entire reason that Johnson would be chosen as the vice presidential nominee, as in the end, Kennedy likely would have won either way. However, choosing to accept Johnson as his vice president, Kennedy was able to pull enough support to himself that he was chosen as the nominee. Kennedy was now the Democratic Party nominee, and his opponent was Republican Richard Nixon. Yes, that Richard Nixon. And funnily enough, Nixon's vice presidential nominee was actually Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., who, if you remember, was the incumbent senator that Kennedy beat back in 1952. The attacks on Kennedy's faith came quickly. Men like Billy Graham and Norman Vincent Peale, two leading Protestant ministers, instantly began to organize across the country with warnings that the Pope would be giving JFK orders and would actually be leading the country. If you have watched the Al Smith episode, then you would know that attacks like these were the ones that essentially doomed his campaign. However, as nearly everyone knows, Kennedy was able to overcome these attacks and would go on to win the election. So the question really is, how? There are really two answers to this. The first was Kennedy as a candidate, and the second was the changing attitudes towards Catholics in the country. Firstly, there can be no doubt that Kennedy was a fantastic candidate. He was quite possibly the best candidate in the entire party. Kennedy was handsome, charismatic, and well-spoken. The best example of this was the first televised debate between Kennedy and Nixon. Kennedy wore makeup, which helped conceal the sweat from the bright lights on the stage, while Nixon refused to. Kennedy seemed at ease and confident, while Nixon looked nervous. It seems hard for us to realize in an age where everything the two presidential candidates do is televised, or at least photographed. But if we can try to imagine what the country back then thought, the fact that you could see the two candidates live and how they held up to questions must have been revolutionary. And if Nixon was nervous during a debate, how could he possibly have the nerve or mental strength to serve as president? I'm sure that I don't even need to comment on Kennedy's strengths in public speaking. Seriously, just go listen to him speak. Even if you hate his politics, you cannot deny that he was a titan of public speaking. However, personal characteristics in public speaking were only half the battle. Kennedy still needed to tackle the issue of his faith, and unlike Al Smith, Kennedy understood that the only way to deal with the issue was to take it by the horns. Kennedy very publicly put distance between himself and the church, and strongly defended the separation of church and state. The most famous quote on the issue comes in Houston in September, where Kennedy stated, "I am not the Catholic candidate for president. I am the Democratic Party candidate for president, who also happens to be a Catholic. I do not speak for my church on public matters, and the church does not speak for me." Kennedy kept pushing the issue that he would not be some puppet set up by the Pope, but would instead be a president for all of America. This is a key difference between Kennedy and Smith. Kennedy was willing and able to refute those who claimed he would be a puppet for the Pope or sell the country out because of his faith. However, Kennedy was also lucky in that he lived after World War II. The effect of World War II was similar to that of the aftermath of 9/11. The country united under a banner of patriotism and brotherhood. We also saw that many of the veterans who fought in the war would realize in the horrors of the trenches and the battlefields that Catholics were not so different to themselves, and that survival depended on trusting the person next to you, even if they were Catholics. That bond proved to be extremely strong, and the veterans who came back to the US pushed the general public towards acceptance of Catholics. Now, I should make clear here that this does not mean that all the anti-Catholic feelings disappeared. Kennedy still faced an uphill battle on the issue of his faith, but the issue was certainly softened when you compare it to Smith's struggle. The material conditions of the country should be discussed as well. If we remember back to Al Smith's episode, he faced off against a very popular incumbent party along with a strong economy. For Kennedy, President Eisenhower was still a fairly popular president, but the country's economy was in a recovery state. The country had just been through a fairly harsh recession in 1958, and that definitely hurt the standing of the Republican Party and Eisenhower. Kennedy was also able to present himself as tough on the Soviet Union and point towards some of the victories by the Soviet Union over the United States in that technological battle to charge the Republican Party as weak on the issue. Kennedy also benefited from the fact that he was seen as a fairly liberal candidate, meaning that he was able to carry some states in the North, such as New York and Massachusetts, that typically went for the more liberal Republican Party. While that may seem strange today, this election really marks the definitive turn for the Democratic Party to turn north and the Republican Party to turn south. In the end, Kennedy would win the election by 0.17% in the popular vote and by 303 to 219 in the Electoral College. This was one of the closest elections in American history. There were some allegations of vote rigging in Texas and Illinois, and if you look at Lyndon Johnson's history of election fraud, they were probably credible. It is really hard to say how much of an effect JFK's faith had on the election. It was certainly an issue, and something that Kennedy had to take seriously. However, the truth is that Kennedy had a lot more going for him than Al Smith. He was young, handsome, and charismatic. He had what was essentially a national-level political machine in the form of his family, along with a great spate of campaigners. The material conditions were not nearly as stacked against him as they were against Al Smith. In fact, it might even be said he had the slight advantage. However, there can be no argument that he handled the issue of faith in a much better way than Al Smith had in the decades previously. Kennedy was willing to talk about the issue and prove his commitment to the separation of church and state, while Al Smith just wanted to plug his ears and talk about politics. The election of JFK marked a turning point in American politics. After Kennedy, the stigma around Catholics in politics nearly completely disappeared. Kennedy proved that Catholics could win on the national level, and he laid the groundwork for Joe Biden some 60 years later. Alright, that is the end of the episode on JFK. The next one will be on John Kerry and Joe Biden. That episode will likely be combined into one, but we will see. As always, leave your thoughts down below. If I got something wrong, call me out, and I'll pin your comment if you're right. I hope you learned something, and I hope you enjoyed. Please also like the video and subscribe as well. It helps the channel grow, which just motivates me to make more content and more often. Peace.